Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Eric Trexler back on the podcast. And in part one, we're diving into all things relating to hard gainers. That's hard gainers in terms of struggling to gain weight. And we talk about the real definition of that and why that might be the case. And also hard gainers from the case of maybe not responding as well to weight training. A really, really interesting discussion. I definitely recommend you stick around for both part one and part two. And as a reminder, we actually email you guys who are on the email list every week with some valuable educational content. And I think there's some stuff on there that you're going to really, really enjoy and you don't want to miss out on, especially if you enjoy the sort of discussions we have on this podcast. You'll find a lot of value from that email list. We don't spam you with tons of rubbish. Don't you worry about that. It's all educational and valuable content. So definitely look in the description to find our email list and sign up to that if you're interested in that sort of thing. Without further ado, let's get into the show. Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Eric Trexler back on the podcast. I don't need to, well, I suppose I didn't give you a formal introduction last time. I actually can't remember if I did, but I don't think so. I think you're a repeat enough guest, Eric, that I don't need to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, no point. My name's Eric and I'm here. That's all the introduction that's necessary.
I hear you are just a sellout and MyFitnessPal, and you're just riding their kind of success and trying to launch your own thing.
Absolutely, yeah. MacroFactor is taking the nutrition app world by storm. That's for sure.
And in all honesty, actually, I have only heard good things about MacroFactor. Not that I didn't intend to really talk about MacroFactor here at all, but this is only positive endorsement for you, because I actually had one client. He was he loves the stuff you and Greg do, and he was so invested. He was like, I'm going to do the stuff we're doing, but also I'm going to track it along MacroFactor and see what numbers that's giving me. So it's actually been quite interesting to see like what my predictions of a coach have been versus the AI that you have within the app. It's been pretty good.
You think that's interesting? Imagine for me, I was working with my own clients who were using MacroFactor, and I wrote the logic for it. And then it becomes a really interesting thing of like, is your systematic logic consistent with your individualized person by person logic? You know, like it's very strange to compete against a software that you wrote the logic for and say like, am I giving the exact same recommendation in all cases that this logic would lead to, which was a very fascinating experience.
And how was that? What was the outcome?
Well, it was good, but like, to be honest, I think the software was better than me. To be honest, because like the thing that's nice about software is it has the extra insight from the expenditure algorithm that without peeking into the app, you have to kind of eyeball it as a coach. The thing about MacroFactor is that the expenditure algorithm is really sophisticated. The weight trending algorithm is very, very nice. And so sometimes, my eyes might lead me in a certain direction and I'll be like, wait a minute, let me see your weight trend curve and your expenditure curve. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, that's a little bit of a noise rather than signal that I'm reacting to. So generally speaking, they're very compatible, very, very similar. But there were a couple instances where there were just like minor disagreements in changes. And ultimately, when I saw what the software was doing, I was like, shit, the software is better than me. Because it doesn't get, it doesn't kind of fall into patterns. It doesn't, take mental shortcuts that the human brain would take, and it can sort through the signal and the noise better than the naked eye. So yeah, that was an interesting experience though.
Does the, I actually haven't used the app yet. I do intend to, at some point. It's just, I'm so set. I imagine a lot of people are like this, so set in their ways of using something like MyFitnessPal for so many years, and it's worked that there's that. Yeah. I don't know what, there's a term for it in like economics or something where it's like that switching cost or whatever it might be. But with the app, can people input like their level of accuracy or precision in terms of the numbers they're putting, if they're like guesstimating things, or like they know they haven't been quite on it and on top of things? Because I imagine as a coach, like this is something I ask my clients is, okay, you give me these numbers, but how precise are they?
Yeah, so what we do is because we have some nice trending and kind of imputation functionality, we basically say, if you think that you can get within a good 20 or 30% in terms of your total calories for the day, go ahead and log it. If it's just way off and you can't even guess, and you don't think you can get with that level of precision, just leave it blank, and we'll use some imputation methods to kind of sort through that missingness in the data. So we do support full day fasting. Not that it's like some kind of like gimmicky recommendation. I know fasting has kind of become a bit of a fad in the nutrition world, especially like longevity focused people. We wanted to accommodate that, so what we have is you can leave a whole day blank in the app in terms of nutrition tracking and just track your body weight, and it'll sort through the data and basically say, okay, let's piece this all together based on previous history. But if you truly do a day of fasting, then you just check a little box and say, hey, I truly ate 0 calories this day. So, that the app can kind of get that signal and move forward accordingly. But yeah, so we don't have like a sliding scale type of deal. And the reality is, our app is very much focused on, we have the expenditure algorithm that is deterministic based on cumulative over time, looking at trends in changes in body weight, body composition, and nutrition intakes. So the reality is, just a little bit of error here and there isn't really going to throw the algorithms off to a meaningful extent. So we haven't had a need to say, hey, were you 80% accurate or 87% accurate? Because over time, that stuff does kind of get smoothed out with the calculations and the smoothing.
That makes a ton of sense. And a lot of the things you were describing there sound like things and actions that you would appropriately take, or I would at least as a coach be looking over the longer term trends. And like if someone is just like very like, I don't know, they rate a 2 out of 5 in terms of accuracy, I'm like, well, it's almost not useful data to a certain degree. It's just like we have to just check body weights and things like this. So that makes a ton of sense. That wasn't a planned kind of discussion around the app, but I'm glad we did it, because I think there are probably, well, the listeners here are prime candidates to be users of the app. And like I said, I've only heard really positive things, and I also much prefer kind of the stuff that you're promoting through the app than what MyFitnessPal does, in terms of if you just sign up to MyFitnessPal, it's not giving you like the recommendations it gives you are things that I would generally not advise people do in terms of those general numbers, whereas you guys are much more evidence-based in that regard. So it's definitely something I would be more pushing people towards.
Well, yeah, I appreciate the shout out and the unscheduled detour, but I will say the last thing I'll mention about it is I know there's a lot of that. The term we use sometimes is stickiness. You start using a tracking app and there's kind of that sunk cost where you're like, well, I'm used to this workflow for tracking. I'm used to the analytics I get in this particular app. So we definitely get that. But if you're curious, we do have a 2-week free trial. So you can take it for a spin, see if you like it. And if you don't, no big deal. You can stick with what you're using.
Perfect. Nice. Guys, get on that. And yeah, to get on to our topic, we're going to talk a bit about hard gainers. So I think everyone listening knows, or has at least has an idea of what they think a hard gainer is. And I think this is one, it's actually just had a lot of sticking power. I think it's not a thing that kind of disappeared. I think some people might regard it as a myth, but I think it has that sticking power for a reason, because there's something there. So I think probably best to start with just defining what at least you would say a hard gainer would be, Eric.
Yeah, I think there's really 2 major characteristics of a hard gainer. Generally speaking, if someone says I'm a hard gainer, what that usually means is they have tried to have, a very focused period of muscle building. They have very intentionally focused on trying to build muscle and have run into a lot of friction in that process. And, from their perspective, apparently more friction than others seem to experience. They might, maybe they and their training partner both say, okay, let's get huge. Let's start bulking. Their training partner starts gaining weight and muscle mass very readily, and they are really struggling to get the needle moving. So the 2 characteristics that often will appear, one can be very easily identified, and that's just, I simply can't gain weight in pounds, in kilograms. Like my scale weight will not budge. Even though I'm eating as much as I can possibly try to eat, I feel gross, just like constantly full, lethargic often comes as an extension of that. So yeah, people are like, I am trying to eat as much as I possibly can, and I can't gain just any weight at all. So that's a very obvious scenario where someone would say, I'm a hard gainer. Another scenario that's a little bit more difficult is not necessarily an inability to gain weight in general, but a really immense challenge when it comes to gaining muscle, right? So you might have someone who says, yeah, I've bulked in the past and I gained 20 pounds, and then I did a 20-pound cut and I ended up literally in the exact same spot, right? Like, so they start to say, I try these bulks and I can gain weight, but every time I do it, it appears to be virtually all fat mass, right? And so there's really these two different components, which one is resistance to weight gain in general, which is, as a nutrition guy, that's where I tend to spend a lot of my focus. But the other element is just kind of in the spectrum of people who are really high responders versus low responders to resistance training. People who fall on the low responder end of that spectrum might notice, even if I do have the ability to gain weight, it just doesn't seem to be muscle, So those are kind of the two most common scenarios for a hard gainer.
And I think that makes complete sense, that the two angles in terms of like resistance to weight gain or kind of that non-responder or less of a responder to resistance training. And I think at least, if we start with the nutritional side, what leads to someone being like that? Because I think we all know someone who seemingly, I guess it's that old, they can eat what they want and they don't put on weight. I guess it's that sort of similar scenario with this person who seems to like really try and eat enough and they struggle to. What leads to a person being like that?
Well, I think there are two things that could be going on, and I assume in many cases that both things are going on. So one thing would be the metabolic response to overfeeding. So there are some studies where they bring people into a lab in really tightly controlled conditions, and they say, we're going to overfeed you by a lot of energy, a lot of extra calories per day in a controlled manner, and we're going to see how much weight you gain. And some people gain way more weight than others. And it appears to be that in this scenario where they are certain that all of the food is being consumed, there are some people who have large upregulations in total daily energy expenditure, and they basically are just burning off a lot of those extra calories. It might not always be all of the extra calories, but I mean, the variation we see in weight gain is really considerable. So there are clearly some people who have what we would call a spendthrift metabolic phenotype, where if you overfeed them from their natural kind of resting body weight, they upregulate energy expenditure and offset a lot of that energy intake, and they're very resistant to fat gain. Other people with more of a thrifty metabolic phenotype, thrifty indicating that they're really good at saving, right? So when you overfeed them, they very efficiently just shuttle those extra calories into long-term fat storage. They gain fat and total weight very, very readily. But the big caveat there that I mentioned is this is overfeeding from a natural kind of typical body weight. If you were to bring those same individuals into the lab, if you were to say, okay, we're going to bring these people in and do a 30-pound cut and then do an overfeeding study, I think the results would look very, very different. And the people who would normally be resistant to fat gain would actually be very susceptible to regaining fat mass that was recently lost. So that's a huge caveat. But in most cases, the typical hard gainer is someone who frankly is naturally quite lean or slender by default, so they're usually going into it from a natural body weight for them and saying, I've been skinny my whole life, I want to get big. And in many cases, we will see that those people who are naturally thin very intuitively are naturally pretty resistant to fat gain, and they do experience those increases in energy expenditure. And it's basically the inverse of metabolic adaptation. Instead of conserving energy when energy intake goes down, they aggressively increase expenditure when it goes up. Now, how do you make yourself be one of those spendthrift individuals? If you're someone who wants to stay lean, you can't. We're talking about just luck of the draw here, or whether it's lucky or unlucky really just depends on your perspective. People who really struggle with fat loss always wish for a certain phenotype, and then people who struggle with weight gain wish for the other, right? So there's both sides of the coin here, and they're spectrums, right? Or spectra. So you're going to fall, not usually, most people are not going to fall on the extreme end of that thrifty to spendthrift spectrum. They're going to fall usually somewhere in the middle. So that's the one thing, is energy expenditure. The other thing that is probably going into this struggle with trying to intentionally gain weight, I think has a lot to do with just the intrinsic systems that regulate body weight within the individual. And I think, to be even more specific, I think the neurophysiological regulation of energy intake is a really big thing. So within the Mass Research Review, we had a great guest article a few years back that was all about the neurophysiological regulation of energy intake and body weight. And it's very clear that there are several different unique systems that are governing hunger, satiety, reward responses to food intake. So just the pleasurable experience of enjoying a large or particularly palatable meal. There are all these integrated systems that, generally speaking, are feeding back into the hypothalamus. And it can be very difficult to override those systems, right? They kind of all have their own little calibration point. And I think in many cases, people who struggle to gain weight, what we probably see is that those systems are just tuned to a slightly different kind of natural calibration point, right? So some people have a very pronounced reward response when they have a hyperpalatable meal. Other people are like, oh yeah, cheesecake is nice, but I can take it or leave it. It's not that big of a deal, right? So some people, it's like a life-changing experience when they have that meal. And it's not because they are, it's not some kind of personality trait that goes into that. It's a neurophysiological response. So the same thing goes when it comes to satiety management, hunger management. I think in many cases, especially in the future, as we look into this stuff more and more, I do think we're going to find that a lot of what goes into where a person's kind of quote unquote natural body weight happens to fall. A lot of it's going to have to do with habits and behaviors, but a large portion of that, I believe, is going to come down to how these different systems that are all integrated, to what point are they calibrated in terms of modulating hunger, satiety, and reward responses. So someone who struggles with weight gain, I would expect those systems are kind of innately calibrated in a situation where hunger tends to be lower than average, satiety responses tend to be a little bit higher than average, and the reward response to a hyperpalatable meal is probably a little bit lower compared to their peers. And I think that can be an extremely, extremely powerful thing. I mean, I had a buddy in high school who, we would always live together and we'd hang out all the time. So we shared a lot of meals together and things like that. I usually could gain weight pretty readily, and he struggled big time. And it was funny because I would watch him, and at that time when you're 16, at least for me, I wasn't exactly as understanding. I kind of didn't have any scientific basis. Just like, well, whatever you try to do will work if you do it hard enough and with enough, intentional effort. So I used to be like, dude, you act like you're eating all this food, but like I'm with you like most days of the week, and you'll eat a ton on Monday and it'll suppress your appetite so much that you don't eat again until like Thursday. And I'm being hyperbolic, but you get the idea. It's like, he's like, oh man, I had this huge meal. I'm like, yeah, that was 4 days ago, dude. And like, you've been grazing for the last 3. So in hindsight, I can look at that and say, okay, like he was making the intentional effort to overfeed, but because of his hunger and satiety regulation, things were really constrained for literally days afterward to kind of get back to that calibration point. And whereas some people can override hunger and satiety signals by simply opting for more hyperpalatable meals, for other people, that ability of the reward centers to override the hunger and satiety centers is blunted because their neurophysiological response to a hyperpalatable meal just isn't that extreme. It's not that pronounced. So long answer there, but I think that's what it comes down to is energy expenditure and neurophysiological regulation of these integrated systems. And I'm sure we'll get into it as we go, but I think that in the bodybuilding world, evidence-based fitness world, people talk about set points with body weight. I mentioned calibration point. I neglected to use the word set point or settling point on purpose. So people talk about set points, they talk about settling points, but I prefer to visualize these challenges within the context of the dual intervention point model. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but there's a great review paper by John Speakman and colleagues where they look at the true official set point theory, and they say this doesn't really work out. If you kind of test it against real world observations, it falls short. It's not very good. Settling point theory, as it's truly written, again, falls very, very short. The set point theory is way too biologically driven without really a lot of room for environmental pressures and behavioral factors. The settling point theory is the opposite. It's great at accommodating environmental factors and behavioral factors, but it leaves little room for like biological, physiological, regulatory intervention or influence. The dual intervention point model is a beautiful way of kind of merging the two concepts together in a cohesive way that actually reflects the world around us, which is good for a theoretical model. And people are going to hear that and say, wow, that's a revelation, because everyone I know talks about set point and settling points. I think most people in our world who talk about settling points are actually talking about the dual intervention point model, but with the wrong terminology.
Yeah, I think I have certainly done that. I normally talk about...
too. I have. Eric Helms had. Literally all of us have. Yeah. It wasn't until I started digging into it and found this paper and I said, oh shit, I've been using words wrong. So yeah, I absolutely have as well.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
I would say like a settling range, which it is exactly describing what that model is in terms of that upper and lower intervention point. It's kind of that range of body fat that the body's happy at. It's kind of homeostasis type of thing. And then it's these upper and lower points that then are kind of where these challenges come in, like you mentioned. And just as a slight summary of what you were saying there, if you are within this kind of this zone of body fat that the body's happy at, you have these people that have these kind of spendthrift or kind of thrifty, more so kind of phenotypes, which influence then whether or not they're more of a hard gainer or not. So you instigate like a 300 calorie surplus to that kind of spendthrift. He suddenly gobbled up 200 calories worth of it, and now it's barely a surplus. Whereas the other thrifty is like, yep, I'll take that on. We gain at a nice steady pace. So This is why, it doesn't really change anything. Pretty much you just have to assess body weight trends and then make the manipulations. But it's just whether or not you want to be that person who's able to eat more. And if you're spendthrift, you get a bit frustrated with how difficult it can be to gain, like you said. Whereas if you're thrifty, you're probably like, man, I wish I could eat more, because it works in harmony that way against what you want. Your biological systems kind of work against you in that sense, which makes sense.
Yeah. And I think the important thing to really highlight here is when we talk about the dual intervention point model, we're talking about ranges in which we encounter friction. And friction is different from insurmountable brick walls that cannot be broken through, right? And so what the dual intervention point model suggests is that there's this range of, body weight or body fat levels, at which we feel pretty comfortable. And like I said, that's probably a convergence of the calibration of our hunger system, satiety system, and reward system, all kind of interacting to some extent. So there's this range of body fat levels, let's say, in which we feel pretty comfortable. There's an upper end of that range and a lower end of that range. And when we are moving within that range, we generally have success and we generally feel pretty okay, right? And so that makes sense because we've looked at short-term interventions and even longer-term interventions where people, by making behavioral adjustments, nutrition adjustments, training adjustments, they can travel within that range without running into a tremendous amount of friction. It's not that unheard of to talk to someone who says, yeah, I made some changes, lost about 10 pounds. I feel great. And I've maintained this weight loss for 5 years. That's not a super rare thing. When you start talking about losing 15% of your body weight, then it becomes a little bit more rare to hear about those super long-term success stories, but they still occur, right? But some of these small fluctuations within this upper and lower intervention point, within this comfortable range, these things can be done by some habitual behavioral interventions with a high degree of effectiveness. But what happens is the lower intervention point is, when we start getting, and this is going to vary from person to person, but when we start to get below a body fat level that's comfortable for us, and like I know for me, there's a certain weight, when I start getting below it, I feel it, hunger, satiety start to get a little bit out of whack. I might feel a little bit more lethargic. We run into that area where we say, okay, I was cruising at the beginning of my diet, but now I'm feeling it. There's friction, and that friction, you can push through it, but you will feel it, right? So there's this regulatory mechanism that kicks in, and the model supposes, based on kind of evolutionary biology, okay, what's happening here is we are starting to interact with our mechanisms to prevent starvation, just from a biological survival oriented perspective. The opposite is the upper intervention point. And so I think this is where, some people might say, oh, I want to bulk up, and they gain 5 pounds, no problem. 10 pounds, no problem. Once they get to 15, they start to say, I cannot even fathom eating more. Like, I feel sick to my stomach every time I eat. This is gross. I'm lethargic. I'm running into some, and the body weight just isn't moving the way it used to be, right? So you start running into the same kind of friction on the upper end. Can you get through it? Sure. And we'll talk about ways you can do that, I'm sure. But the idea there, as the model proposes, is that ultimately having excessive adiposity or excessive body weight as a biological animal that could be hunted is not ideal. So humans, from an evolutionary perspective, need a certain level or prefer to have a certain level of mobility for survival purposes. And the idea is that we increase our risk of predation, of essentially becoming somebody's dinner, if we start to accumulate weight at a rate that starts to influence our mobility and ambulatory capacity. So that's the concept, is that we can absolutely fluctuate within this range without a whole lot of friction. It takes some intention and effort, but not like, major physiological friction. But once we start to get outside of these boundaries, that's where we start to run into some challenges. And what I would expect is that someone who is a spendthrift individual, perhaps identifies as a bit of a hard gainer, their kind of normal resting state is probably relatively close to their upper intervention point. And their upper intervention point is the reason they're closer to it is because it's probably just set a little bit lower than the average person. Conversely, people who really struggle with weight loss, they tend to gravitate toward a higher body weight. And when they try to lose fat, it becomes immensely difficult very quickly. I expect that their lower intervention point is kind of naturally just higher than others, and their kind of typical resting spot is just relatively close to it when compared to their peers. So this model, like we said, it's reframing stuff that we've already kind of embraced in the fitness world as kind of misusing the term settling point. But I do think it's valuable to look at this model sometimes and say, what am I experiencing and how would I make sense of it based on this concept? Because I think it can be a very comprehensive model that helps you make sense of what you're experiencing or what your client's experiencing.
Yeah. That makes a load of sense in terms of, like, we all have this kind of range, but those who are more spendthrift, that are more hard gainers and spendthrift, are probably going to have this kind of, it's set at a lower body fat or lower body weight for them, whereas the more thrifty, they're always striving to be that kind of on the leaner side, but they struggle with that necessarily. So that makes a load of sense. In terms of the range itself, do you have a theorized kind of, I don't know, percentage of body weight range, or is it like a tight range or wide range? Will that, I presume as well, it would differ person to person?
Absolutely not. I don't, I know everyone in the fitness world is different. There are some folks who are like, you know what, in the interest of practical application, I'm going to boldly put numbers out there and deal with the consequences later. I'm very much the opposite side of the spectrum, where I'm like, until I feel very, very certain, I'm just going to let that one go. But I do think if someone twisted my arm, I think we could look at possibly the weight loss literature and start to say, okay, well, what are the success rates long term, losing 5% of body weight versus 10% of body weight versus 15 versus 20. I think the fact that, we often call a clinically useful or clinically meaningful weight loss in the overweight and obese population as being about 10% of body weight in many cases, the long-term success rates in that particular literature are a little bit underwhelming. People throw around the numbers about the likelihood of returning to baseline body weight, and the probability is higher than we would like, unfortunately. So I think we could lean, if someone twisted my arm, I would say, yeah, I'll go dig into that literature and give you a percentage number. I assume it would be less than 10% based on that, but I'm not going to commit to any number until I put in just indefensible amount of work into digging into that literature and figuring out what it looks like. But I think it generally is broadly pretty tight. I know for me personally, if I don't do a damn thing aside from just lift and eat comfortably, I tend to gravitate around 175. And I can tell you, if I start getting below 160, it starts to get really, really tough. And if I get above 190, I can hardly eat a meal. So for me personally, I have about a 15 pound range in either direction from baseline, where I feel pretty comfortable moving with behavioral adjustments that do take intention and consistency, but I don't run into physiological friction. Whereas once I go more than 15 pounds down or more than 15 pounds up, I start to run into challenges. But I also am not so brazen and self-absorbed as to suggest that generalizes to everybody, and I think that's a major thing you have to consider if you're in the coaching business, is making sure that you don't jump to those assumptions. Because I've had some clients who it's like, their weight it's like clockwork within like a very narrow range. And once we start trying to move it, we get friction immediately in just about any direction, and so it's important not to dismiss those experiences with clients. And I've also had clients who it's like, we just start going and going and going, and we really don't run into a lot of friction until we're getting like shredded. So I think it's important to recognize upper intervention point, lower intervention point, where we are relative to both of those at what we consider our natural body weight. That's probably going to have a lot to do with our habits and behaviors, like where we fall in that range. But it differs from person to person. So you shouldn't be surprised if you're working with a client and you say, oh crap, it looks like we were already just nestled right against that lower intervention point before we even started. So that's important to recognize, where you are, where you tend to kind of settle within those points is going to vary based on a lot of habitual and behavioral type stuff. It's important to recognize that the upper intervention point and lower intervention point might be shifted from person to person. And it's also important to recognize that the distance between them can be highly variable. That's not based on research. That's based on practice in my experience. So whether or not that's good to have a tight range, it really comes down to one question: how do you like your natural body weight?
Yeah.
And like, if you love your natural body weight and you've got a tight range, like, dude, you're set. It means that like you're just not going to fluctuate much from there no matter what you do, which is great. But for someone who's unhappy with their kind of typical point that they tend to settle at, having that tight range all of a sudden becomes a really cumbersome thing. So with these types of things, it's a fascinating model that I think does a great job describing the world around us. But what I think is really fascinating about it is the pros and cons of it are totally based on your personal perspective and what you wish to achieve. So it's this kind of unbiased set of intervention points that says, hey, whether you like it or not, here's what you've got to work with, and how you react to that is kind of up to you.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.
Very well answered. And I appreciate just being honest about we don't know this range. And in my experience, very similar to yours, I think for most of my clients, it has been like a 5 to 10% range where we start to kick a fuss if we go far too much more out of those kind of ranges. But I do have, more often than not, it's a case of quite a few people, they have a lower intervention point, but that upper intervention point is kind of comes into question of, you could just keep pushing them and they keep eating, they've got a great appetite past a body fat that someone would want to necessarily be at. And I guess evolutionary speaking, maybe I guess that might make more sense, or at least in our modern day environment, that might be what's influencing it, because there's so many highly palatable foods and just ways to be sedentary and that sort of thing. So it's more that side of it, which maybe has influenced the upper end intervention. Yeah.
And I wasn't, if people are watching video, I wasn't just like texting my friend. I was curious, because I mentioned 175 plus or minus 15. I was like, what percentage is that? And it ends up being about 8.6%. Yeah. So just under that 10% number. That is one piece of data confirming my general hunch that the number's probably shy of 10%, just looking at the literature. But again, I'm going to quickly scamper away from that number and never, ever put my name on it publicly. But anecdotally, that's about what I experience.
And I guess if people are wondering, like, how do I identify if I'm in this range? What are some of the things that you think people should not feel or they should feel in this sort of period of time?
Well, I think, this range, it's important to recognize it is descriptive rather than actionable, right? So it's not like we're saying, oh, you're outside of the range, therefore do the next 3, things in response to that, right? So it helps us understand what we're experiencing, but I don't know if we should plan necessarily around it, because ultimately our goals are going to be independent of in many cases, where upper and lower intervention points are. The only exception is if you're talking about someone who's kind of general population, trying to diet down to a lower body weight for health purposes. I think it would make sense to work with them and say, okay, well, based on our experience of being, going from 190 to 180, 90, 80, 76, at what point here did we start to really feel crappy, right? And so you start to identify what's the lowest weight that we could very feasibly maintain in the long term and be comfortable. So I guess there is some application there. But I would say, when you're wrestling with your lower intervention point, some signs you would look out for is, perhaps even though you have a pretty reasonable caloric deficit, you might start running into some symptoms of like relative energy deficiency in sport. So some of the psychological things, you might notice that you have a little bit more food fixation psychologically. You might notice that hunger and satiety start to get disproportionately out of whack. You may notice potentially some changes in endocrine profile in terms of like thyroid hormone and sex hormones. Maybe that kind of depends how lean you're getting, but we often talk about how natural bodybuilders at a certain point, you start to feel kind of crappy. And then at a certain point, you start to feel very shitty, right? And so lower intervention point, I think, is where kind of crappy begins in my rough estimation. I know that it sounds like a precise diagnostic when I say kind of crappy, but it's actually very vague. I'm being a smartass here, but you know, when you start to get to that point where like, man, I know I'm dieting, so I should feel hungry, but my hunger starts to feel like it's kind of ramping up disproportionately. And the extent to which I feel lethargic seems to be ramping up disproportionately. Maybe you're noticing metabolic adaptation, a reduction of energy expenditure starting to kick in, and you're noticing every time I reduce my calories by 150, I seem to be getting less bang for my buck when I make those changes. Like when we start to see those types of things happening, it might be an indicator that we're starting to drift beyond that lower intervention point. With the upper intervention point, I think it's kind of the inverse. When we start to recognize, like, I've been making kind of linear calorie increases, but it looks like I'm just not gaining weight at the rate I used to. Or, I knew I'd be full, but I'm starting to run into more of a brick wall when it comes to just like trying to get the next meal in. You have to start pulling more of those creative levers of overcoming the fact that you have like no appetite. When appetite really starts to get just totally decimated, that's probably when we're starting to hit that upper intervention point. So I know that those are vague metrics, but I think it's one of those things you kind of know it when you see it, because here's the easiest heuristic you could use as a coach. When you start working way harder, that usually means, like when you start saying, okay, now we need to pull out all the stops when it comes to behavioral stuff, psychological support. When you start really pulling out the entire bag of tricks and tools, that usually indicates, it's not just, hey, let's drop a little bit of carbohydrate here, or a little bit of fat. Now it's, okay, we need to start focusing on coupling habits together. We need to start focusing on, taking a walk here, or like for weight loss purposes. Okay, what are some behavioral habitual interventions we can use to supplement so that this isn't just sheer willpower and targets? We have to start getting into some of those other things to overcome a lot of this friction pertaining to, adaptations and energy expenditure, hunger satiety regulation, things like that.
I think that makes a ton of sense, in that it's not like a precise thing, but I think a lot of people can relate to how hard they have to try to move the needle in a certain direction. And like you called it, kind of those frictions, it's not like a hard stop. It's just suddenly things are getting disproportionately harder to where they were before. And I guess that has to fall on a background of, you've already got kind of your basics in check, in terms of like, if your sleep's just terrible, you're sleeping an hour a night or something, well, you're probably going to feel things are going to be harder no matter what. But you just have the basics in check, in terms of like, you have your nutritional timing somewhat there. You're not eating kind of one meal and you're like, oh, I'm stuffed. I don't know what it could be for that individual, but you've got kind of some of the basics in check. And then like you said, once the basics are there, maybe you have to start looking at some of the other things. And to bring it back to kind of hard gainers, as we were talking about, because I threw us down the road of this model, but I find it fascinating, because when you are a coach, you work with so many different people that you see that where people lie on this thing. And actually, one question before I do move on to hard gainers, because I think people will be thinking this, and I hate if I didn't ask it. Can you move this? Can someone who, they're kind of, I guess most people are thinking, I'm kind of up here. Generally, I feel better at higher body fats, higher body weights. Personally, I would like to be on the leaner side. Can someone get to this lower point and maintain kind of in a lower range where they feel okay? Or are they always going to feel a bit more friction that's trying to like pull them back?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not familiar with strong evidence indicating that you can truly change this. Of course, one of the major roadblocks for obtaining that type of evidence is that these are vague concepts. Rather, you can't bring someone in at baseline and say, okay, we're going to do this blood assay and determine your lower intervention point, right? So even if you were to move it, it'd be hard to say it moved. What we have to rely on is just kind of vague, general indicators that someone lost a significant or gained a significant amount of weight and was able to maintain it for a long time. We have to kind of look at the outcome and then work back from there. The fact that most of the long-term predictors of for example, weight loss success, maintaining a weight loss for a long period of time. The reason I keep going back to weight loss is because to lean on the science of weight regulation is to focus on weight loss, because that's the major public health concern that gets studied so much, right? But when we look at what is predictive of long-term successful weight loss maintenance, it's almost always behavioral. It's almost always at that intersection of behavior and psychology. So acceptance-based approaches to hunger, accepting that, the previous lifestyle and behaviors, which may have been quite sedentary and included a lot of social eating and really high calorie foods in social settings. There are certain elements of those kind of behavioral factors that it seems like letting those go and resetting some of your habits and behaviors seems to be critical. So consistent weight monitoring, maintaining high levels of physical activity, keeping an eye on your calorie intake consistently over time, those types of things. It seems that because behaviors are so much more predictive of long-term success than, weird little physiological hacks, I'm inclined to believe that we probably don't have a tremendous amount of autonomy when it comes to manually shifting our intervention points, but that doesn't mean we're screwed in the long term. What it means is we are better off focusing on how we can reset and reestablish our habits and behaviors so that the act of maintaining a body weight outside of our dual intervention point range, what we need to do is make that more automatic. It can't continue to be this straight up battle of willpower versus physiology, because that's a tough battle to fight for 30 years. And usually the physiology wins. But if you can say, well, instead of willpower, let's alleviate the need to lean on that by focusing on habits and behaviors, and let's automate some of this stuff. If you can do that and start to establish a set of patterns and behaviors that is actually compatible with maintaining this different body weight, I think that ultimately is the blueprint for success, and tells us that even if you are slightly outside of that intervention point range, there are ways to do this without making it a constant struggle that is totally dependent on willpower. And I think that is really where success lies. Whether or not we can shift those intervention points a little bit, we don't seem to have any reliable predictors of weight change success that are independent of some of those bigger picture psychological and behavioral elements.
No, I think that makes complete sense. And in my experience of So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge, and I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.